The desert had been killing the 7-year-old girl for 3 full days when Thomas Whitfield's white horse suddenly stopped and refused to move. Staring at a rock formation everyone had already searched twice. In 12 hours, the child would either be home with her mother or buried in the unforgiving Arizona sand. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert sun hung merciless in the cloudless Arizona sky, turning the red sand into a shimmering ocean of heat that could kill a grown man in less than a day. For a 7-year-old child, the odds were even worse. Little Star had been missing for 3 days now, and everyone in the small settlement near Canyon de Chelly knew what that meant. The elders had already begun preparing for the mourning ceremony, their faces carved with the resignation of people who understood the desert's cruelty all too well. But Thomas Whitfield wasn't ready to give up. The 42-year-old cowboy sat astride Ghost, his pure white Mustang, scanning the endless expanse of sand and rock that stretched before them like the surface of an alien world. The horse beneath him shifted restlessly, sensing his rider's tension, the animal's coat gleaming like fresh snow against the burnt orange landscape. Thomas had been searching since dawn, following a trail so faint that most trackers would have given up hours ago. A disturbed pebble here, a scuff mark in the sand there, signs so subtle they might have been nothing more than wind patterns or the passage of a jackrabbit. Before we continue with Thomas's desperate search, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something truly incredible lined up for you. Thomas had lived in Arizona territory for 20 years, ever since the war had ended and he'd found himself unable to return to the Virginia farm that no longer existed. The desert had claimed him the way it claimed everything that stayed long enough, teaching him its languages of silence and survival, of patience and sudden violence. He knew its moods, understood its dangers, and respected its absolute indifference to human suffering. That knowledge was what kept him searching when logic said the child was already gone, taken by heat or thirst or the predators that hunted these endless spaces. The story of how Little Star had disappeared was simple and tragic in the way of all such stories. She had been playing near the settlement while her mother worked, had wandered just a bit too far chasing a lizard or a butterfly, and by the time anyone noticed she was missing, the afternoon wind had already erased her tracks. The search party that formed immediately had found nothing. The men from the nearby fort had found nothing. Even the child's own people, who knew this land as intimately as their own heartbeats, had found nothing but desert and more desert stretching endlessly in every direction. Thomas had joined the search on the second day, bringing Ghost and his own particular set of skills. He was known throughout the territory as a man who could track anything, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the landscape and understand where creatures, human or otherwise, might go when lost or frightened. Some said he had Indian blood himself, though his weathered face and gray eyes suggested pure frontier stock. Others claimed he'd learned his skills from the Apache during his early years in the territory, back when such friendships were more common and less complicated by the conflicts that now divided the region. The truth was simpler and more mundane. Thomas simply paid attention. He watched how animals moved, how the wind shifted sand, how light changed the appearance of tracks throughout the day. He understood that a lost child wouldn't think like an adult, wouldn't follow logical paths, or seek obvious shelter. A frightened 7-year-old girl would run until exhaustion stopped her, would seek comfort in small spaces that reminded her of safety, would follow any feature of the landscape that seemed less terrifying than the alternatives. Ghost nickered softly, his ears pricking forward towards something Thomas couldn't yet see. The horse had been his companion for 5 years, found as a yearling colt wandering alone in the desert, and the bond between them went deeper than simple rider and mount. Thomas trusted the animal's instincts as much as his own, knew that Ghost could sense things beyond human perception, could hear sounds too faint for human ears, and smell water from miles away. The cowboy urged the horse forward, letting the animal pick his own path across the treacherous terrain. They moved slowly, methodically, Thomas's eyes constantly scanning the ground and the horizon in equal measure. The desert was full of places where a small child could hide or fall, arroyos that cut through the landscape like wounds, rock formations that created pockets of shadow and shelter, caves and crevices that promised protection but could become death traps without water. He'd brought supplies for an extended search, knowing that if he found Little Star alive, she would need water immediately, food if she could take it, and medical attention that might mean the difference between a rescue and a recovery. His canteen was full, his saddlebags packed with jerky and hardtack, a blanket for warmth if the search extended into another night. Ghost was strong enough to carry 2 riders if necessary, smart enough to find his way home even in darkness, patient enough to endure whatever the search required. The morning wore into afternoon, and still they found nothing definitive. A few marks that might have been footprints, some disturbed stones that could have been moved by anything, shadows and suggestions that led nowhere. Thomas felt the familiar weight of doubt beginning to settle over him. The knowledge that despite all his skills and Ghost's instincts, they might be searching for a ghost themselves, a child already claimed by the desert's indifferent hunger. But he kept searching because stopping meant accepting defeat, and Thomas Whitfield had never been particularly good at accepting anything the desert tried to tell him. His stubbornness had kept him alive through drought and flood, through encounters with hostile raiders and angry wildlife, through the countless small disasters that defined frontier existence. That same stubbornness now kept him riding through heat that made the horizon dance and shimmer, through country that seemed to repeat itself endlessly, across landscapes that could hide a million secrets beneath their deceptive simplicity. Ghost's ears pricked forward again, more insistently this time, and the horse's pace quickened slightly without any signal from his rider. Thomas leaned forward in the saddle, his hand moving instinctively to shade his eyes against the brutal glare. Ahead, perhaps 200 yards distant, a cluster of red rock formations rose from the desert floor, like the broken teeth of some ancient giant. The rocks created shadows, blessed relief from the sun's assault, and more importantly, they offered the kind of shelter a frightened child might seek. He'd passed a dozen similar formations that morning, each one promising hope and delivering nothing but more emptiness. But Ghost's reaction suggested this time might be different. The horse picked his way carefully across the intervening distance, avoiding the scattered barrel cacti and the treacherous patches where the sand concealed harder ground beneath. Thomas could feel the animal's muscles tensing with each step, could sense the same anticipation that was building in his own chest. After 3 days in this merciless heat, any child would be in desperate condition, probably unconscious, possibly already beyond help. He tried to prepare himself for what he might find, tried to steel his heart against the likelihood of failure. But hope was a stubborn thing, almost as stubborn as the man who carried it. As they drew closer to the rock formation, Ghost suddenly stopped and nickered again, this time with unmistakable urgency. Thomas dismounted smoothly, his boots hitting the hot sand with barely a sound, and approached the rocks on foot. The formation was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a maze of stone pillars and overhangs that created a network of shadows and small caves. Perfect hiding places for a child, but also perfect traps where someone could become wedged or injured, unable to escape even if they wanted to. He moved slowly, carefully, calling out as he went. His voice was gentle, unthreatening, speaking in the mix of English and the few native words he'd learned over the years. He wanted to project safety, not alarm, knowing that a frightened child might try to hide even from rescue if they'd been alone long enough for fear to become their primary companion. The rocks threw his voice back at him in strange echoes, fragmenting his words into ghostly repetitions that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he might have imagined it, a whimper, or perhaps just the wind moving through the stone crevices. Thomas froze, every sense straining to locate the source. Ghost had moved closer, his massive head lowered as if trying to peer into the shadows, and the horse's focused attention told Thomas everything he needed to know. She was here. Little Star was somewhere in these rocks, and she was alive enough to make sound. He followed Ghost's gaze to a narrow opening between two large boulders, a space barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders, but perfect for a small child. Thomas dropped to his knees and peered into the darkness, waiting for his eyes to adjust from the blinding sunlight to the deep shadow. At first he saw nothing but stone, and more stone. But then movement caught his attention, a slight shift in the darkness that resolved itself into the huddled form of a child. Little Star was wedged into the narrowest part of the crevice, her small body curled into a ball, her dark hair matted with sand and sweat. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and rapid, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. She wore the simple cotton dress she'd disappeared in, now torn and stained, and her bare feet were cut and swollen. Thomas's heart clenched at the sight, fury and relief warring in his chest. 3 days. 3 days this child had survived in conditions that would have killed most adults. He spoke softly, carefully, not wanting to startle her. Called her by name, told her she was safe now, that he was going to help her, that her mother was waiting for her. Little Star's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed with fever. But there was no recognition in them, no understanding that rescue had finally arrived. She was beyond conscious response, her body shutting down from dehydration and exposure, fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. Thomas assessed the situation with the quick calculation of long experience. The crevice was too narrow for him to enter fully, but he could reach her if he was careful. The greater challenge would be extracting her without causing further injury, and doing it quickly enough that she might survive the journey back to the settlement. Every minute counted now. Every moment of delay brought her closer to the point where even water and medical care wouldn't be enough. He called to Ghost, and the horse moved closer, understanding in that uncanny way of his exactly what was needed. Thomas pulled his canteen from the saddle and a clean cloth from his supplies, then returned to the crevice opening. He soaked the cloth in water and squeezed a few drops onto Little Star's lips, watching as her tongue moved instinctively to catch the moisture. It was a good sign, her body's automatic response to the promise of water, evidence that she wasn't yet completely gone. Working with infinite patience, Thomas managed to get his arm into the crevice, reaching far enough to grasp Little Star's shoulder. She was burning with fever, her skin hot even through the fabric of her dress, and he could feel how thin she'd become, how fragile. He talked to her constantly as he worked, his voice steady and calm, telling her stories about Ghost, about the settlement, about her mother's love and worry, anything to keep a thread of connection between them. The extraction took nearly an hour of careful, agonizing work. Thomas had to remove several smaller rocks that blocked the opening, widening the space incrementally, while being careful not to cause a collapse that might trap or injure the child further. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dust and sand until he could taste the grit in his mouth, but he never rushed, never let frustration overcome caution. This child had survived 3 days in hell. He wasn't going to lose her now through impatience or carelessness. Finally, with Ghost watching like a concerned parent, Thomas was able to ease Little Star out of her rocky prison. She was limp in his arms, unconscious again, her breathing frighteningly shallow. He carried her into the deeper shade of an overhang and laid her gently on the blanket he'd spread on the ground. Her pulse was rapid and thready, her skin dry despite the fever that raged through her small body. She was severely dehydrated, possibly dying, and they were miles from any kind of medical help. Thomas had seen dehydration before, had treated it in men and animals, knew the delicate balance required to rehydrate someone without causing further damage. Too much water too quickly could be as dangerous as no water at all, shocking a system that had adapted to scarcity. He wet the cloth again and placed it on her forehead, then carefully dribbled a few drops of water between her cracked lips, watching to make sure she swallowed reflexively. Ghost moved closer, his large head lowering to sniff at the child with gentle curiosity. The horse's presence seemed to reach Little Star in some way that Thomas's voice couldn't. Her eyes flickered open briefly, focusing on the white horse, with something that might have been wonder or might have been delirium. Thomas took advantage of the moment to give her a bit more water, still being careful, still monitoring her response. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Thomas made the difficult decision about what to do next. The settlement was at least 4 hours away, probably 5 or 6 at the careful pace he'd need to maintain with such a fragile passenger. Riding through the night was dangerous, but staying here meant another night in the desert for a child who might not survive it. The rock formation offered shelter and shade, but no water except what he carried, and his supply was limited. He looked at Ghost, and the horse looked back with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to understand everything. They'd been through impossible situations together before, had survived blizzards and stampedes, had crossed rivers in flood and deserts in drought. If any horse could carry them safely through the coming journey, it was this one. Thomas made his choice. They would ride through dusk and into darkness, trusting Ghost's instincts and his own knowledge of the stars to guide them home. First, though, Little Star needed more water, and whatever strength he could give her for the journey ahead. Thomas continued the slow process of rehydration, drop by careful drop, watching for any sign that her body was rejecting the water or that he was moving too quickly. Gradually, after perhaps an hour of patient effort, he saw color beginning to return to her lips, saw her breathing become slightly less labored. She wasn't out of danger by any measure, but she was stable enough to move. He wrapped her carefully in the blanket, creating a cocoon that would protect her from the sun during the remaining daylight and from the cold that would come with nightfall. Then he mounted Ghost with the child held securely against his chest, one arm supporting her weight while the other managed the reins. It was an awkward position, one that would become increasingly painful as the hours passed, but it kept Little Star close to his body heat and allowed him to monitor her condition constantly. Ghost seemed to understand the precious nature of his cargo. The horse moved with exquisite care, each step deliberate and measured, avoiding the rough patches and steep descents that might jostle his riders. Thomas had always known the animal was special, but this journey would prove it beyond any doubt. They moved across the desert like a ghost themselves, silent except for the soft crunch of hooves on sand and the occasional murmur of Thomas's voice as he talked to both horse and child, weaving a verbal thread that connected all three of them in their shared purpose. The sun continued its relentless descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Thomas had any attention to spare for beauty. His entire focus was on the child in his arms and the path ahead, calculating distances and speeds, monitoring Little Star's breathing and Ghost's stamina, constantly reassessing whether his decision to ride through darkness had been the right one or a fatal mistake driven by desperation. Little Star stirred occasionally, small movements that reassured Thomas she was still fighting, still present in her damaged body. Each time she moved, he gave her a few more drops of water, building gradually toward the amount she would need to survive. Her fever remained high, but no longer seemed to be climbing, and her breathing, while still shallow, had developed a more regular rhythm. These were small victories, but in the desert, small victories were often the difference between life and death. As the light began to fail, Thomas felt Little Star shift against his chest and heard a sound he'd been hoping for since he found her. Her voice, cracked and barely audible, formed a single word in her own language. He didn't know what it meant, couldn't translate the sound, but the meaning was clear enough in its tone and desperation. She was calling for her mother, reaching across the darkness for the comfort and safety that only a mother's presence could provide. Thomas tightened his arm around her carefully, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant as much to soothe as to inform. He told her they were going home, that her mother was waiting, that she was safe now and nothing would hurt her again. Whether she understood his words or just responded to the gentleness in his tone, he couldn't say, but she seemed to relax slightly against him, some of the terrible tension leaving her small frame. Ghost carried them steadily onward as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Those ancient guides that had led travelers across deserts and oceans since humans first learned to read their patterns. Thomas knew these stars intimately, had navigated by them countless times, and tonight they would guide him home with the most precious cargo he'd ever carried. The desert night settled around them with its characteristic swiftness, temperature dropping as dramatically as it had risen during the day, and Thomas adjusted the blanket to keep Little Star warm. They were perhaps 3 hours from the settlement now, moving through darkness that would have terrified most riders, but which Thomas accepted as simply another challenge to overcome. Ghost's white coat seemed to glow in the starlight, making them visible to anything watching from the shadows, but also making it easier for Thomas to judge their path and pace. The horse moved with unwavering confidence, trusting his own instincts and his rider's guidance in equal measure, carrying them through the night like the ghost his name suggested. Thomas's arm was beginning to cramp from holding Little Star's weight, but he forced himself to maintain his grip, knowing that any slip could prove fatal. The child seemed lighter than she should be, her body wasted by 3 days without food or adequate water, and he could feel every bone through the thin fabric of her dress. It made him angry in a way he couldn't quite articulate, this unnecessary suffering of an innocent child, this casual cruelty of circumstance that had nearly claimed her life. The desert didn't care about innocence or justice, didn't distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving. It simply existed, beautiful and terrible, taking what it wanted without conscience or consideration. The night air carried sounds that daylight smothered, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of creatures moving through sagebrush, the whisper of wind across sand that sounded almost like voices if you listened long enough. Thomas had learned years ago not to listen too closely to the desert's night voices, not to let his imagination transform natural sounds into supernatural threats. The real dangers were concrete enough: rattlesnakes that hunted in darkness, arroyos that could fill with flash floodwater in minutes during storm season, the simple but deadly possibility of Ghost stepping wrong and going lame miles from help. But Ghost didn't step wrong. The horse moved with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where to place each hoof, that could sense dangers Thomas couldn't see and avoid them with the same uncanny instinct that had led them to Little Star's hiding place. Thomas had long since stopped questioning how the horse knew things, had accepted that some connections between humans and animals transcended normal understanding. Ghost was more than transportation, more than a working animal. He was a partner, a friend, a miracle in horse form that had chosen Thomas as surely as Thomas had chosen him. Little Star stirred again, her small hand clutching weakly at Thomas's shirt. He looked down at her face, barely visible in the starlight, and saw her eyes were open and focused on him with something approaching awareness. For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed truly present, truly conscious of her situation. He smiled at her, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth, and spoke softly in the mix of English and native words he knew. She tried to speak, her voice a bare whisper that he had to lean close to hear. The words were in her own language, too complex for his limited vocabulary, but the tone was questioning, uncertain. Thomas understood she was asking where they were going, whether she was safe, whether this was real or just another fever dream conjured by her dying mind. He answered as best he could, pointing up at the stars and then toward the horizon, where the settlement lay hidden by darkness and distance. Ghost's ears flicked back, listening to the conversation, and the horse nickered softly as if adding his own reassurance to Thomas's words. Little Star's gaze shifted to the white horse, and something that might have been a smile touched her cracked lips. She said something else, and this time Thomas caught a word he recognized. Beautiful. She was calling Ghost beautiful, and the simple observation, so ordinary and childlike despite everything she'd endured, nearly broke Thomas's carefully maintained composure. He gave her more water, pleased to see her swallow more strongly now, her body beginning to respond to the rehydration. Her fever still burned, but the worst edge seemed to have passed, and color was slowly returning to her face. She wasn't safe yet, wouldn't be safe until she was under medical care with proper food and rest and treatment, but the immediate crisis of dehydration seemed to be passing. Thomas allowed himself a small measure of hope, carefully controlled and realistic, but hope nonetheless. The landscape around them gradually began to change as they traveled, the flat desert giving way to rolling terrain dotted with more substantial vegetation. Thomas recognized landmarks that told him they were perhaps 2 hours from the settlement now, maybe less if Ghost maintained his steady pace. The horse showed no signs of tiring, his breathing regular and his step sure. But Thomas knew better than to push an animal past its limits. If Ghost needed rest, they would rest, regardless of the urgency that drove Thomas forward. Little Star had fallen into what seemed like genuine sleep rather than unconsciousness, her breathing deeper and more regular. Her body relaxed against Thomas's chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid but steady, and the rise and fall of her breathing reassured him that she was moving toward recovery rather than decline. 3 days in the desert should have killed her. That she'd survived at all spoke to either tremendous luck or tremendous will, probably both in combination, with the simple fact that children were often more resilient than adults gave them credit for. Thomas thought about his own childhood, growing up on that Virginia farm that no longer existed, running wild through fields and forests with a freedom that seemed impossible now in hindsight. He'd been Little Star's age once, 7 years old and convinced of his own immortality, taking risks that should have killed him a dozen times over. The war had taken that immortality and replaced it with a deep awareness of human fragility, of how quickly and easily life could end. But it had also taught him the flip side of that coin, how stubbornly life could persist, even in the worst circumstances, how the human body and spirit could endure things that seemed impossible until you witnessed them firsthand. Little Star was proving that truth again, surviving where she shouldn't have, holding on when letting go would have been easier. The moon rose late, a sliver of silver that added its light to the stars and made navigation even easier. Ghost seemed to quicken his pace slightly, as if he too sensed they were approaching home and safety. Thomas shifted Little Star's weight carefully, easing the cramp in his arm without waking her, and allowed himself to think ahead to what would happen when they reached the settlement. There would be joy and relief, certainly, but also questions and concerns. The child would need immediate medical attention, food prepared carefully for a stomach that had been empty too long, warmth and comfort and the presence of her mother. Thomas wondered about that mother, about what she'd endured during the 3 days her daughter was missing. He'd seen her briefly when the search parties were organizing, a young woman whose face was carved with grief and terror, whose eyes held the terrible knowledge that her child was almost certainly dead. She would be at the settlement still, Thomas knew, probably awake and watching for any sign of returning searchers, hoping against hope for a miracle that everyone had told her wouldn't come. Well, Thomas thought, looking down at the sleeping child in his arms, sometimes miracles did come. Sometimes prayers were answered and impossible things happened and children survived when all logic said they shouldn't. He didn't consider himself particularly religious, had lost most of his faith during the war, when he'd seen what men could do to each other in the name of competing gods. But he believed in the possibility of grace, in moments when the universe bent toward mercy instead of cruelty. and tonight felt like one of those moments. The terrain continued to change, becoming more familiar with each passing mile. Thomas recognized rock formations and prominent trees, landmarks that told him exactly where they were and how much farther they had to go. Less than an hour now, maybe only 45 minutes at Ghost's steady pace. The horse's ears were pricked forward eagerly, clearly recognizing the territory as well, and anticipating the end of their long journey. Little Star woke as they crossed a shallow creek bed, the change in Ghost's gait probably disturbing her sleep. She looked around with more awareness than before, her eyes taking in the moonlit landscape with something approaching interest rather than confusion or fear. Thomas felt her small body tense as she tried to orient herself, tried to understand where she was and what was happening. He spoke to her again, his voice gentle and reassuring, and felt her gradually relax as his words and tone penetrated her lingering fear. She said something in her own language, a longer phrase this time, and Thomas caught enough words to understand she was asking about Ghost. She wanted to know the horse's name, wanted to understand the animal that was carrying them through the darkness with such care and confidence. Thomas told her, pointing to the horse's white coat gleaming in the moonlight and explaining how the animal had found her when no one else could. How Ghost had known exactly where to look and had led them to her hiding place. Little Star reached out with one small hand, touching Ghost's neck with tentative wonder. The horse turned his head slightly, acknowledging her touch with a soft snort, and Thomas saw something pass between child and animal, a connection that transcended species and situation. It was the kind of moment that reminded him why he'd stayed in the desert, despite its harshness, why he'd built a life in this unforgiving landscape, because beneath the cruelty and danger, there was also this, moments of pure grace and connection that made everything else worthwhile. They topped a small rise, and suddenly Thomas could see the settlement in the distance, a scattering of lights that represented safety and civilization and the end of their desperate journey. Ghost saw it too, and quickened his pace again, sensing home and rest and the completion of his task. Thomas felt his own heart lift at the sight, relief flooding through him with an intensity that surprised him. They'd made it. Against all odds, through darkness and danger, across miles of treacherous desert, they'd brought Little Star home alive. He urged Ghost into a careful trot, not quite willing to risk a full gallop in darkness, but eager now to close the remaining distance. Little Star stirred against his chest, and he looked down to see her eyes fixed on the distant lights, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. She said something else in her language, and though Thomas didn't know the exact words, he understood their meaning. Home. She was recognizing home, seeing the place where her mother waited, understanding that her nightmare was finally ending. The sound of their approach carried across the quiet night, and Thomas saw figures beginning to emerge from the buildings, silhouetted against the lamplight from doorways and windows. Someone must have been keeping watch, hoping against hope that searchers might return with news, and now that watch was being rewarded. He could hear voices calling out, urgent and questioning, demanding to know who was approaching and what news they carried. Thomas raised his voice, calling back with the words everyone had stopped believing they would hear. He'd found her. Little Star was alive. The settlement erupted into motion. People poured from buildings in various states of dress, some carrying lamps that bobbed and swayed as they ran toward the approaching rider. Thomas could hear his name being called, questions shouted in multiple languages, the rising sound of hope and disbelief mixing into a chorus that echoed across the desert night. Ghost maintained his steady pace through all the commotion, unbothered by the chaos his arrival was causing, focused only on completing the journey he'd begun hours earlier. Thomas saw her before she saw him, Little Star's mother pushing through the crowd with desperate urgency, her face a mask of hope and terror. She'd wrapped a shawl hastily around her shoulders, and her long, dark hair hung loose around her face, unbound in her haste. Her eyes searched frantically among the approaching figures, looking for any sign of her daughter, and when they finally locked onto the small form in Thomas's arms, the sound that came from her throat was something between a sob and a prayer. Thomas dismounted carefully, still holding little Star secure, and the child's mother was there immediately, reaching for her daughter with trembling hands. The reunion was wordless at first, beyond language, just a mother touching her child's face and hair and hands as if to confirm she was real and alive. Tears streamed down her face unchecked, and little Star, despite her weakness and fever, reached up to touch her mother's cheeks with wondering fingers, as if she too needed confirmation that this wasn't just another fever dream. The woman spoke rapidly in her own language, words tumbling over each other in a torrent of relief and love and questions. Little Star answered in weak whispers, her voice still damaged from days without water but present and real. Thomas stood back, giving them this moment, feeling Ghost's presence beside him like a warm shadow. The horse's work was done, the child delivered safely home, and now they could both rest. Dr. Patterson, the settlement's physician, pushed through the crowd with his medical bag already in hand. He was a practical man in his 50s, weathered by years of frontier medicine, and he assessed little Star with quick efficiency even as her mother held her close. His questions were direct and pointed, addressed to Thomas rather than the distraught mother. How long had she been without water? What condition had he found her in? Had she been conscious? What treatment had he already provided? Thomas answered each question carefully, recounting the discovery in the rock formation, the signs of severe dehydration and fever, the gradual rehydration process he'd followed during their journey. Dr. Patterson nodded approvingly at each detail, clearly pleased that Thomas had known enough not to give the child too much water too quickly, not to rush treatment that required patience and careful monitoring. The doctor gently examined little Star while her mother held her, checking her pulse and breathing, looking at her eyes and the condition of her skin. "She needs to be in bed immediately," Dr. Patterson said, his voice carrying the authority of medical necessity. "Fluids, rest, and careful feeding over the next several days. She's severely malnourished and dehydrated, and that fever concerns me. It could be just exposure, or it could be the beginning of something worse. We'll know more in the next 24 hours. The mother nodded understanding even as she clutched her daughter closer, clearly unwilling to let go now that she'd been returned. Another woman stepped forward, one of the settlement's elders, and spoke gently to the mother in their shared language, guiding her toward one of the nearby buildings where little Star could be properly cared for. As the crowd began to disperse, following the mother and child toward shelter and safety, Thomas found himself suddenly alone except for Ghost and a handful of men who'd been part of the original search parties. They approached him with expressions of amazement and gratitude, wanting to know how he'd found her, where she'd been, how he'd known to keep looking when everyone else had given up. Thomas told the story simply, giving most of the credit to Ghost's instincts and the child's own will to survive. One of the men, a grizzled prospector named Jim Crawford, shook his head in wonder. 3 days in that heat, he said. 3 days without water. That child should be dead 10 times over. Thomas agreed quietly, remembering the moment he'd first seen little Star's small form wedged in those rocks, remembering how close she'd come to never being found at all. "It was Ghost," he said, nodding toward the white horse who stood patiently nearby. "He knew where to look. He found her when I would have ridden right past." The men looked at the horse with new respect, seeing not just an animal, but the instrument of a miracle. Ghost seemed unimpressed by their attention, more interested in the water trough one of the stable hands was filling for him. Thomas smiled at the horse's priorities, understanding that for Ghost, this had just been another day's work, another task completed with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Someone brought Thomas coffee and food, and he accepted both gratefully, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the search and rescue was draining away, leaving behind bone-deep weariness and the beginning of pain in muscles he'd held tense for hours. His arm ached from holding Little Star's weight. His back protested the hours in the saddle, and his eyes burned from scanning the desert in darkness and firelight. But beneath the physical discomfort was a profound satisfaction. The knowledge that he'd accomplished something that mattered. That a child who should have died was alive because of choices he'd made and actions he'd taken. Jim Crawford sat beside him on the bench outside the general store, sipping his own coffee in comfortable silence. After a while, the older man spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You know, most men would have quit searching after the first day. Would have figured the desert had claimed another victim, and there wasn't any point in risking themselves for a lost cause." Thomas considered this, thinking about all the moments during his search when doubt had tried to overwhelm determination, when logic had suggested giving up. "I couldn't quit," he said finally. "Not while there was still a chance." The prospector nodded, understanding something in Thomas's words that went deeper than the specific situation with Little Star. "You lost someone once, didn't you? Back in the war, maybe. Someone you couldn't save." Thomas felt the old familiar ache in his chest, the weight of memories he usually kept carefully locked away. His younger brother Charlie, who'd followed him into the army despite being barely 16. Charlie, who'd taken a bullet meant for someone else, and had died in Thomas's arms while the battle raged around them. Charlie, who Thomas had promised their mother he'd keep safe, a promise broken in blood and chaos. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly, "I lost someone." Crawford didn't push for details, didn't ask questions that would force Thomas to relive what he preferred to forget. The older man just nodded again and refilled Thomas's coffee cup from the pot someone had brought out. "Sometimes we get a chance to balance the scales," he said. "Doesn't change what we lost, but it helps knowing we saved someone else's brother or daughter or son." The words settled over Thomas like a blanket, warming something in him that had been cold for a long time. Maybe that was part of why he'd pushed so hard to find Little Star, why he'd refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. Maybe every rescue was an attempt to redeem past failures, to prove that loss didn't have to be permanent and inevitable, that sometimes the story ended differently than it had for Charlie. Ghost finished drinking and moved to stand beside Thomas, the horse's head lowering to rest against his shoulder in a gesture of companionship and shared fatigue. Thomas reached up to stroke the white neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. This horse had been his salvation in more ways than one, giving him purpose and partnership when he'd been drifting aimlessly through grief and survivor's guilt. Together they'd built something meaningful out here in the desert, a life that mattered even if it was simple and solitary. Dr. Patterson emerged from the building where Little Star and her mother had been taken, and the men around the store immediately fell silent, waiting for his report. The doctor looked tired but satisfied, which Thomas took as a good sign. "She's stable," he announced. "Fever's coming down. She's taking fluids well, and her mother's with her. I expect she'll make a full recovery, though it'll take time. That child has more fight in her than most adults I've treated." The relief that swept through the gathered men was palpable, shared breath released in unison. The doctor approached Thomas directly, extending his hand for a firm shake. "You saved her life," he said simply. "Another few hours, and it would have been too late." The dehydration was severe enough that her organs were beginning to shut down. "If you hadn't found her when you did, if you hadn't known how to treat her properly during the journey back, we'd be planning a funeral instead of a recovery." Thomas accepted the compliment with quiet grace, deflecting as much credit as possible to Ghost and to Little Star's own resilience, but Dr. Patterson wouldn't let him minimize his role. "Don't sell yourself short, Whitfield. What you did tonight required skill, courage, and determination. This settlement owes you a debt. The night was growing late, or rather early, the darkness beginning to lighten around the edges with the first hint of dawn. Thomas needed rest desperately, and Ghost needed proper care after their long journey. He stood slowly, his body protesting the movement, and took Ghost's reins. Several men immediately offered to tend the horse for him, to make sure Ghost was properly cooled down and fed and settled for the night, but Thomas declined. This was something he needed to do himself, a private moment between him and the animal who'd made everything possible. The stable was quiet and dark, lit only by a single lantern hanging near the door. Thomas led Ghost to a spacious stall and began the familiar routine of removing tack and brushing away the dust and sweat of their journey. His hands moved automatically through tasks he'd performed thousands of times, finding comfort in the repetition and simplicity. Ghost stood patiently, occasionally turning his head to watch Thomas work, and the companionable silence between them felt more meaningful than any words could have been. When the horse was finally clean and comfortable, with fresh hay and grain and water available, Thomas rested his forehead against Ghost's neck for a long moment, just breathing and being still. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing the horse couldn't understand the words, but hoping the emotion behind them would communicate what language couldn't. Ghost nickered softly in response, and Thomas chose to believe it was acknowledgement, acceptance of gratitude offered, and partnership recognized. He left the stable as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern horizon with streaks of pink and gold, another desert dawn breaking over a landscape that had nearly claimed a child's life, but had instead become the stage for her salvation. Thomas walked slowly back toward his own small cabin on the edge of the settlement, his body demanding rest, but his mind still racing with the events of the past 24 hours. He thought about little Star sleeping safely in her mother's arms, about Ghost resting in his stall, about the strange chain of circumstances that had led him to the right place at the right time. Before he reached his cabin, he saw a figure waiting on his small porch, a woman he recognized as little Star's mother. She rose as he approached, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill, her face showing the marks of tears and sleeplessness, but also something else, something that looked like peace. She spoke in her own language, words that flowed like water, and though Thomas couldn't understand most of them, he caught enough to know she was thanking him, expressing gratitude that went beyond simple words into something deeper and more sacred. He responded in his limited vocabulary, telling her that any man would have done the same, that he was just glad little Star was safe. But the woman shook her head firmly, clearly disagreeing with his modest assessment. She pressed something into his hands, a small object wrapped in soft leather, and closed his fingers around it before stepping back. Her eyes held his for a moment, communicating something that transcended language barriers. Then she turned and walked away, back toward the building where her daughters slept and healed. Thomas waited until she was gone before unwrapping the object, finding a small carved figure of a horse, white stone polished smooth by patient hands. It was beautiful in its simplicity, capturing the essence of equine grace and strength in just a few elegant lines. He understood it was meant to represent Ghost, a talisman of gratitude and remembrance, something he would treasure not for its material value, but for what it represented. The mother had likely carved it herself years ago, had kept it as something precious, and now she'd given it to him as the only payment she could offer for her daughter's life. Thomas held the carving carefully, turning it over in his weathered hands and feeling the smoothness of the stone against his calloused palms. The weight of it was surprisingly substantial, as if it carried more than just physical mass, but also the weight of significance and meaning. He would keep it always, he decided, a reminder of this night and this rescue, of the moment when everything had gone right instead of wrong, when the desert had given back instead of taking away. It would sit on the small shelf in his cabin beside the few other objects he'd collected over his years in the territory, each one marking a moment when life had surprised him with grace instead of grief. Inside his cabin, Thomas finally allowed himself to collapse onto his narrow bed, not even bothering to remove his boots or dusty clothes. Sleep claimed him instantly, pulling him down into darkness so complete that dreams couldn't penetrate. He slept through the morning and into the afternoon, his body demanding payment for the hours of tension and effort he'd invested in Little Star's rescue. When he finally woke, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting his cabin walls with amber light that spoke of another day nearly gone. His body ached in places he'd forgotten could ache, muscles protesting their recent abuse with sharp reminders of mortality and limitation. Thomas moved slowly, carefully assessing damage and finding nothing serious, just the expected consequences of hours in the saddle holding awkward positions. He washed his face in the basin beside his bed, the water cold and shocking against his skin, bringing him fully back to wakefulness in the present moment. Through his window, he could see the settlement going about its normal business, people moving between buildings with the casual purpose of everyday life continuing despite the previous night's drama. He dressed in clean clothes and made his way outside, intending to check on Ghost before anything else. The stable was busy with afternoon activity, horses being tended and tack being cleaned, the normal rhythm of care that kept animals healthy and equipment functional. But when Thomas reached Ghost's stall, he found the horse already groomed and fed, his white coat gleaming in the dusty light filtering through the stable's high windows. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, was sitting on the stall's edge, talking to Ghost in quiet tones while the horse listened with apparent interest. The boy looked up as Thomas approached, his face brightening with recognition and something like awe. "You're the man who found Little Star," he said, the words tumbling out with childish excitement. "Everyone's talking about it. They say you rode all night through the desert and your horse is magic." Thomas smiled at the description, understanding how stories grew in the telling, how ordinary events became extraordinary through repetition and embellishment. "Ghost isn't magic," he said gently, "just smart and brave and good at his work." The boy looked at Ghost with worshipful eyes. "Can I help take care of him? I promise I'll do everything right. I've been learning about horses from Mr. Patterson at the stable." Thomas considered the request, seeing in the boy's eager face an echo of his own youth, his own desperate need to be useful and valued. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy straightened proudly. "Daniel, sir. Daniel Morrison. Dr. Patterson's my uncle. He said I should come help with your horse as payment for saving Little Star, since she's my friend from school." The simple logic of childhood obligation touched Thomas more than he expected. He nodded slowly, making the agreement formal and significant. "All right, Daniel. You can help me with Ghost's care, but it's serious work, not play. You have to be reliable and careful and always put the horse's needs first. Can you do that?" Daniel's face lit up with joy. "Yes, sir. I promise. I'll be the best helper you ever had." Thomas extended his hand, and they shook on it man to boy, sealing their bargain with the gravity it deserved. Later, walking through the settlement toward the building where Little Star was being cared for, Thomas found himself stopped repeatedly by people wanting to express gratitude or simply shake his hand. The attention was uncomfortable for a man who preferred solitude and the company of his horse to human society, but he understood it represented something important for the community. Little Star's survival had become a shared victory, a rare moment when the harsh frontier gave back instead of taking away, and people needed to acknowledge that miracle, needed to thank someone for making it possible. Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife and Daniel's aunt, intercepted him before he could reach Little Star's door. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, practical and no nonsense in the way of frontier women who'd survived decades of hardship. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Before you go in, You should know that Little Star has been asking for you. She wants to thank you herself, wants to see the man who brought her home." Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness that surprised him. Facing down desert dangers was one thing, but facing a child's gratitude felt somehow more challenging, more emotionally complex than any physical threat. Mrs. Patterson seemed to sense his hesitation. "She's just a little girl who wants to say thank you," she said more gently. "You don't have to say much. Just let her see you're real, and that you're all right. Sometimes survivors need to know that their rescuers survived the rescue." Thomas nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words, and followed her into the building. The room where Little Star lay was small but comfortable, windows open to catch the afternoon breeze, her mother sitting beside the bed with patient vigilance. Little Star looked remarkably better than she had the previous night. Color returned to her face and clarity in her dark eyes. She was propped up on pillows, a bowl of broth on the table beside her bed, evidence that she was taking nourishment and beginning the slow process of rebuilding strength. When she saw Thomas in the doorway, her face brightened with recognition and something deeper, a connection forged in shared survival and desperate circumstances. She spoke in her own language, words flowing quickly, and her mother translated with quiet dignity. "She says you are the man with the white horse who found her in the rocks. She says Ghost spoke to her in the darkness and told her to hold on, that help was coming." Thomas felt his throat tighten at the image. This child alone in darkness, finding comfort in a horse's presence, real or imagined. He moved closer to the bed, careful to maintain respectful distance while still showing engagement. "Ghost is a good horse," he said simply. "He's always known where to find lost things." Little Star smiled at that, a genuine expression of childish delight that transformed her face. Her mother translated again, adding her own words to her daughter's. "She wants to know if she can see Ghost again when she's well enough to walk. She wants to thank him properly for saving her life." Thomas nodded, already imagining the scene. This small girl reunited with the white horse who'd led to her rescue. "Of course," he said. "Ghost would like that. He enjoys having friends." The simple promise seemed to satisfy Little Star completely. She settled back against her pillows, her eyes already beginning to drift closed with the exhaustion that still claimed her at random intervals. Her mother stood and guided Thomas back toward the door. But before they left, Little Star spoke one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's translation was quiet, but clear. "She says you have a good heart, like the white horse. She says the spirits sent you to save her because they knew you would not give up." Thomas didn't know how to respond to that, didn't have words adequate to the faith this child and her mother had placed in him. He simply nodded, accepting the blessing for what it was, and stepped out of the room into the afternoon light. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in the hallway, her expression knowing. "Children see things clearly sometimes," she observed. "They haven't learned to doubt their instincts yet. Maybe Little Star's right about the spirits sending you." Thomas walked back to his cabin as evening approached, his mind full of the day's events and the ongoing impact of the previous night's rescue. The carved horse figure sat on his shelf now, catching the last light of day and seeming to glow with inner luminescence. He thought about Little Star's words, about spirits and destiny and the mysterious ways that lives intersected and changed each other. He'd never considered himself a spiritual man, had lost most of his faith to war and loss. But standing here in his simple cabin looking at this gift, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not quite belief, but perhaps the possibility of belief, the acknowledgement that maybe the universe operated on principles more complex than simple chance and coincidence. Ghost was waiting at the fence when Thomas went out to check on him one final time before dark, the horse's white coat luminous in the gathering dusk. Daniel had done his work well, the stall clean and fresh water provided, and Ghost looked content and rested. Thomas spent a few minutes just standing with the horse, not speaking, not needing to, just sharing space and breath in the comfortable silence that had always characterized their relationship. "You did good," he finally said, his hand resting on Ghost's neck. "That little girl thinks you're magic. Maybe you are." The horse's response was characteristically practical, a soft nicker that suggested he was more interested in the apple Thomas had brought than in philosophical discussions about magic and destiny. Thomas smiled and offered the apple, watching Ghost's careful enjoyment of the treat, and felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. This was enough, he thought. This simple life with this good horse occasionally making a difference in ways that mattered. He didn't need grand purpose or dramatic meaning. He just needed this, moments of connection and usefulness, opportunities to balance the scales against past losses and failures. The days that followed Little Star's rescue fell into a new rhythm, one that included regular visits to check on the child's progress and unexpected integration into the community that Thomas had always kept at arm's length. He'd lived in the settlement for years but had never been part of it, preferring the solitary existence of a man who'd seen too much human cruelty to trust easily in human kindness. But Little Star's survival had created a bridge between him and the other residents, forcing him to accept connection he'd avoided for so long. Dr. Patterson provided daily updates on Little Star's condition, each report more encouraging than the last. The fever broke completely on the third day. Her appetite returned with startling intensity, and she began insisting on getting out of bed despite her mother's protective concerns. "Children are resilient," the doctor observed during one of Thomas's visits. "Their bodies heal faster than adults, and their spirits bounce back from trauma in ways that never cease to amaze me. She'll have nightmares probably, memories that surface unexpectedly, but she'll be all right. She's strong, that one." Thomas watched Little Star's recovery with quiet satisfaction, seeing in her rapid healing a kind of redemption for past failures he couldn't change. Each day she grew stronger, felt like a small victory against the desert's casual cruelty, against the randomness of fate that could destroy lives without reason or warning. He thought often about his brother Charlie, about how different things might have been if Charlie had received the same careful treatment and patient recovery time that Little Star was getting. But war didn't allow for such luxuries, didn't pause for healing or second chances. Daniel proved to be an excellent helper with Ghost, arriving at the stable every morning with the sunrise and staying until his other responsibilities called him away. The boy was naturally gentle with animals, understanding instinctively how to approach them without causing fear or aggression. He talked to Ghost constantly, telling the horse about his day and his dreams and his plans for the future, and Ghost seemed to genuinely enjoy the companionship. Thomas found himself looking forward to these morning sessions, teaching Daniel proper horse care while listening to the boy's endless stream of observations and questions. "You must have seen a lot of places," Daniel said one morning while brushing Ghost's mane with careful strokes. "The war and everything, did you always want to be a cowboy?" Thomas considered the question, thinking about the young man he'd been before the war, full of plans and certainties that had evaporated in the smoke and blood of battlefields. "No," he admitted, "I thought I'd be a farmer like my father, raise crops and maybe a few horses, live my whole life in the same county where I was born." But things changed. Daniel absorbed this with the seriousness of childhood, understanding that sometimes life didn't follow the paths people planned. "My pa died when I was little," he said matter-of-factly. "Fever took him, and Ma too. That's why I live with Uncle William and Aunt Margaret now. Did the war take your family?" Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old grief that never quite disappeared no matter how many years passed. "Some of them," he said quietly. "War takes a lot from people, not just lives but futures and possibilities. It's why I prefer living out here where things are simpler." The boy nodded thoughtfully. then returned his attention to Ghost, with the easy adaptability of youth. "Well, I'm glad you're here," he said, "because if you weren't, little Star would be dead, and everyone would be sad. So maybe some good came from the bad things that happened to you." The simple wisdom of the observation struck Thomas deeply, forcing him to consider perspectives he'd never allowed himself before. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe the chain of events that had brought him to the territory, broken and grieving, had been necessary for him to be in the right place at the right time to save a child's life. It didn't erase the losses or make them meaningful, but it suggested that even pain could eventually lead to something worthwhile. A week after the rescue, little Star was finally well enough to leave her bed for short periods. Her first request, delivered through her mother with shy determination, was to visit Ghost. Thomas arranged the meeting for a cool morning when the sun wouldn't be too intense, and half the settlement turned out to witness the reunion between the child and the horse who'd saved her. Little Star walked slowly, still weak but growing stronger daily, her mother's hand supporting her elbow while she navigated the short distance from her building to the stable. Ghost seemed to sense the significance of the moment, standing perfectly still at the fence while little Star approached. The child's face was radiant with joy and wonder, her dark eyes fixed on the white horse with an intensity that spoke of deep connection. She said something in her own language, words that flowed like water, and her mother translated with obvious emotion. She says Ghost is more beautiful than she remembered, that his coat is like fresh snow under moonlight, that his eyes are kind like the eyes of ancient spirits. Thomas helped little Star reach up to touch Ghost's face, supporting her slight weight, while she ran small fingers over the horse's muzzle and forelock. Ghost stood absolutely motionless, as gentle and patient as Thomas had ever seen him, understanding somehow that this child was fragile and precious. Little Star laughed, a sound of pure delight that seemed to lift the hearts of everyone watching, and Ghost nickered softly in response. The moment stretched out, perfect and complete, a connection between species that transcended language and logic. Daniel stood beside Thomas, watching the interaction with shining eyes. "Do you think they're talking to each other?" he whispered. Thomas considered the question seriously, watching the way little Star leaned her forehead against Ghost's neck, the way the horse's breathing slowed and deepened in response. "In their own way," he replied quietly. "Not with words, but with something deeper. Understanding, maybe, or just recognition of shared experience. They both survived something hard, and that creates a bond." Little Star spent nearly an hour with Ghost, her strength lasting longer than anyone expected. She told stories in her own language, translated by her mother for the benefit of the growing crowd, stories about the 3 days she'd spent alone in the desert. She described the heat and thirst, the fear that had been her constant companion, the moments when she'd been certain she would die. But she also described hearing Ghost's hoofbeats in the distance, seeing his white form appear like a vision against the red rocks, knowing with absolute certainty that salvation had arrived. "The desert tried to take me," she said through her mother's translation, her small hand still resting on Ghost's neck. "But Ghost wouldn't let it. He came through the darkness and told me to be strong, told me someone was coming who wouldn't give up. And then the man with the kind eyes found me and brought me home." Thomas felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward him, felt the emotion of the moment threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. He'd spent 20 years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of connection and the inevitable losses it brought. But this child and this community were dismantling those walls brick by brick, forcing him to acknowledge that isolation wasn't strength, but a different kind of surrender. Mrs. Patterson approached Thomas as the crowd began to disperse, little Star having tired herself out and been carried back to bed by her grateful mother. "You've changed something in this settlement," she said thoughtfully. given people hope that even when things seem impossible, sometimes miracles still happen. That's worth more than you probably realize. Thomas didn't know how to respond to that, didn't have words for the strange mixture of discomfort and satisfaction he felt at being seen and valued by these people he'd kept at distance for so long. That evening, sitting on his cabin porch with the carved horse figure in his hands, Thomas allowed himself to acknowledge something he'd been avoiding since the rescue. He wasn't the same man who'd ridden out to search for Little Star. Something fundamental had shifted in him during those hours of desperate searching and careful treatment, during the journey through darkness with a dying child in his arms. The walls he'd built around his heart had developed cracks, and through those cracks was seeping something he'd thought he'd lost forever during the war. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the willingness to believe that life could offer redemption along with loss, grace along with grief. Ghost nickered from his nearby corral, and Thomas looked up to see the horse watching him with those intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to understand everything. "You knew, didn't you?" Thomas said aloud, not caring if anyone heard him talking to an animal. "You knew I needed this as much as Little Star did. Needed to save someone. Needed to matter again. Needed to remember that good things can still happen even in hard places." The horse's response was characteristically simple. A soft snort that might have meant anything or nothing, but Thomas chose to interpret it as agreement. The weeks following the rescue brought unexpected changes to Thomas's solitary existence. Where once he'd spent days alone with just Ghost for company, now he found himself regularly drawn into the settlement's daily life. People stopped him on the street to share news or ask his opinion on matters both trivial and significant. Daniel appeared every morning without fail to help with Ghost, bringing his endless enthusiasm and questions. Little Star's mother brought gifts of food and handmade items, expressing gratitude in the practical ways of frontier people who understood that survival often depended on community support. Thomas discovered that being part of a community wasn't as uncomfortable as he'd convinced himself it would be. The people of the settlement asked nothing from him except his presence and occasional participation, didn't demand explanations for his past or push him to share more than he was willing to give. They simply accepted him as one of their own, the man who'd saved Little Star, who rode a white horse with an almost magical ability to find lost things. The legend was growing beyond the simple facts, as legends always did. But Thomas found he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. Little Star's recovery continued to exceed all expectations. Within 3 weeks of her rescue, she was back to her normal activities, running and playing with other children as if the ordeal had never happened. But there were changes in her too, subtle shifts that Thomas recognized from his own experience with trauma. She never wandered far from the settlement's central area now, always keeping adults within sight. She carried a water flask constantly, even for short walks, an instinctive protection against ever being caught without resources again. And she sought out Ghost's presence regularly, spending hours at the corral talking to the white horse in the mix of English and her own language that seemed to deepen their mysterious connection. One afternoon, Thomas found Little Star and Daniel sitting together near Ghost's corral, the two children engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation. He approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt, and caught fragments of their discussion. Daniel was explaining how to properly groom a horse, demonstrating brush strokes on an imaginary animal, while Little Star watched with focused attention. "When do you think Mr. Whitfield will teach me to ride?" she asked, and Thomas heard the longing in her voice. "I want to learn how to sit on Ghost and go fast across the desert, like they did when he saved me." Daniel's response was immediate and practical. "You have to start slow. Uncle William says rushing with horses is how people get hurt, but maybe if you ask Mr. Whitfield nice, he'll teach you someday when you're bigger." Thomas stepped into view then, making his presence known, and both children turned to him with matching expressions of hope and anticipation. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, settling onto the fence rail near where they sat. And Daniel's right that rushing is dangerous, but learning to ride is something that should start young, when fear hasn't had time to take root. Little Star's face lit up with joy so pure it made Thomas's chest ache. "You'll teach me? Really?" He nodded slowly, committing himself to something he hadn't planned, but which felt absolutely right. "I'll teach both of you," he said, including Daniel in the promise. Ghost is patient enough for beginners, and there's no better horse to learn from. But you have to promise to follow instructions exactly and never take risks without permission. The children's enthusiastic agreement came in unison, and Thomas found himself smiling at their excitement, caught up in their uncomplicated joy. The riding lessons became a regular feature of the following weeks, with Thomas discovering he had unexpected talent for teaching. He started the children on the basics: how to approach a horse properly, how to read equine body language, the importance of respect and clear communication. Daniel already knew some of this from helping with Ghost's care, but Little Star absorbed every lesson with the intensity of someone who'd formed a bond with horses that transcended normal human-animal relationships. She seemed to instinctively understand what Ghost needed, moving with a natural grace that suggested she'd been born to ride. Ghost, for his part, showed remarkable patience with his young students. The horse, who could be particular and demanding with adult riders, became gentle and accommodating with the children, adjusting his pace and movements to their skill level with what seemed like conscious decision. Thomas watched this transformation with amazement and growing affection, understanding that Ghost's character ran deeper than he'd ever fully appreciated. This wasn't just a well-trained animal following commands, but a thinking, feeling being who understood the trust being placed in him and rose to meet it. The first time Little Star actually sat on Ghost's back, supported by Thomas's steady hands and Daniel's encouraging words, she laughed with such delight that people emerged from nearby buildings to see what was causing such joy. The moment felt significant beyond its simple components, representing healing and new beginnings in the transformation of trauma into triumph. Thomas walked Ghost in slow circles around the corral, while Little Star gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination, her fear and excitement balanced in perfect tension. When they finally stopped and he lifted her down, she threw her arms around his waist in a spontaneous hug that surprised them both. "Thank you," she said in carefully practiced English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for Ghost. Thank you for teaching me." The simple gratitude, delivered with such sincerity, threatened to undo Thomas completely. He patted her shoulder awkwardly, unused to physical affection but unwilling to reject what she offered. "You're welcome," he managed, his voice rougher than usual. "You're a natural rider. Keep practicing and someday you'll be better than me." As autumn arrived and the brutal summer heat finally began to ease, Thomas found his life had transformed in ways he never could have anticipated. The solitary existence he'd carefully constructed over 20 years had been replaced by something richer and more complex. His mornings now included not just caring for Ghost, but teaching 2 eager students who arrived like clockwork to continue their riding education. His afternoons often involved unexpected visits from settlement residents who'd discovered he was willing to help with various tasks requiring his particular skills. His evenings sometimes included shared meals with families who'd adopted him into their circles, refusing to let him retreat back into isolation. The change wasn't always comfortable. Thomas still craved solitude, still needed time alone with his thoughts and memories. But he was learning to balance those needs with the demands and rewards of community, finding that human connection didn't have to mean losing himself entirely. He could participate without surrendering his core identity, could care about others without being consumed by that caring. It was a delicate balance, but one he was slowly learning to maintain. Little Star's progress as a rider exceeded even Thomas's optimistic expectations. She had a gift for it, an intuitive understanding of how to move with a horse rather than fight against it. Within 2 months of starting lessons, she could walk, trot, and canter with confidence, her small body moving in perfect rhythm with Ghost's gait. More impressive was her fearlessness, the way she approached each new skill without the hesitation that plagued most beginner riders. Thomas recognized it as the paradoxical result of her desert ordeal. Having survived the worst the frontier could offer, she had no fear left for ordinary challenges. Daniel's progress was steadier but no less satisfying to watch. The boy lacked Little Star's natural talent but made up for it with determination and careful attention to detail. He studied every aspect of horsemanship with scholarly intensity, asking questions that sometimes revealed insights Thomas had never consciously considered. Why does Ghost lower his head when he's content? How does he know which direction to go just from pressure on the reins? What makes some horses spook easily while Ghost stays calm? The questions forced Thomas to articulate knowledge he'd absorbed through years of experience, making him a better teacher by requiring him to truly understand what he was teaching. The riding lessons became a highlight of Thomas's week, something he looked forward to with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He'd been teaching the children for 3 months when Little Star asked a question that changed everything. "Mr. Whitfield," she said one afternoon while grooming Ghost after a particularly successful lesson, "why don't you have children of your own? You're so good at teaching us." Daniel had been about to leave but stopped at the question, equally curious about the answer. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the instinctive retreat from personal questions that touched too close to old wounds. But looking at these 2 children who'd given him so much without asking for anything except his time and attention, he found he couldn't deflect as he normally would. "I had a brother once," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "He was young, not much older than Daniel when he died. I was supposed to take care of him, but I failed. After that, I thought maybe I wasn't meant to have a family, wasn't meant to be responsible for anyone else's life." Little Star moved to stand directly in front of him, her dark eyes serious and intent. "But you saved me," she said simply. "You took care of me when I was dying in the desert. You didn't fail me." Thomas felt emotion rising in his throat, threatening to choke off his words. That was different, he managed. That was just being in the right place at the right time. "No," Daniel said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Uncle William says you searched when everyone else had given up. Says you kept looking because you believed she could still be alive. That's not luck, Mr. Whitfield. That's caring." The simple truth of the boy's observation struck Thomas deeply. He'd spent 20 years telling himself he was broken, that his failure to save Charlie had permanently damaged his ability to care for others without bringing them harm. But these children, with their uncomplicated wisdom, were showing him a different narrative. Maybe his failure with Charlie hadn't made him incapable of protecting people. Maybe it had made him more determined to never let anyone die alone and abandoned if he could prevent it. Maybe tragedy could transform into purpose instead of just paralysis. Ghost nickered softly, reminding them all of his presence, and the moment shifted back to lighter matters. The children finished their tasks and headed home as the sun began its descent, leaving Thomas alone with his horse and his thoughts. He stood at the corral fence for a long time, watching Ghost graze in the fading light, thinking about the strange journey that had brought him from Virginia, farm boy to broken soldier, to desert cowboy, to something he didn't quite have a name for yet. Protector, maybe, or teacher, or simply someone who'd learned that redemption wasn't a destination, but a series of small choices to keep trying despite past failures. That evening, Little Star's mother appeared at his cabin door with a proposal that would further reshape his understanding of his place in the community. She brought an elder with her, a woman named Blue Dove who spoke both English and the native language with equal fluency and whose presence commanded immediate respect. Thomas invited them in, offering the simple hospitality of coffee and the few chairs his cabin contained, sensing that whatever brought them here was significant enough to require formal acknowledgement. Blue Dove spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of authority and tradition. "Little Star's mother has asked me to make a request on her behalf," she said, her English precise and carefully chosen. "She wants to honor you properly for saving her daughter's life. In our tradition, such a debt requires recognition through ceremony and gift-giving that reflects the magnitude of what was saved. But she knows you are not of our people and may not understand or want such things. She asks what form of thanks you would accept that would ease her heart." Thomas felt immediately uncomfortable with the formality of the situation, with being placed in a position where his preferences would determine someone else's ability to fulfill a cultural obligation. He looked at Little Star's mother, seeing in her face the same desperate sincerity her daughter had shown, the need to balance scales that felt perpetually tilted by the weight of unpayable debt. "I don't need thanks," he said carefully. "I'm just glad Little Star is alive and well. That's payment enough for me." Blue Dove translated his words, then listened to the mother's response before turning back to Thomas. "She says you misunderstand. This is not about what you need, but about what she needs. To leave such a debt unacknowledged goes against everything she was taught, everything her ancestors practiced. It dishonors both of you for the gift of life to be treated as something ordinary rather than sacred. She is asking you to let her honor you, not for your benefit, but for hers and her daughter's." The reframing shifted Thomas's perspective completely. He'd been thinking about this from his own discomfort with recognition and gratitude, but Blue Dove was right that sometimes acceptance of thanks was itself a gift to the giver. "All right," he said slowly. "What does she want to do?" The elder smiled, clearly pleased by his willingness to understand. "She wants to hold a ceremony where her people can acknowledge what you did, where Little Star can publicly thank you in ghost, where the community can witness the honoring of a debt. It would be a feast and celebration, not a solemn affair, but important nonetheless." Thomas's first instinct was to refuse, to avoid being the center of attention for what he still considered just doing what any decent person would do. But looking at Little Star's mother, at the hope and need in her expression, he found he couldn't deny her this. "If it's important to her," he said, "then I accept." Blue Dove translated, and the mother's face transformed with relief and joy. She spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over each other, and Blue Dove laughed softly before translating. "She says you have given her daughter life twice now, once by saving her body and once by honoring her mother's need to give thanks properly. She says Ghost must be at the ceremony too, since he is as much a part of the rescue as you are." After they left, Thomas sat in his cabin feeling overwhelmed by the direction his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a solitary man with a horse, existing on the margins of the settlement, carefully maintaining distance from emotional entanglement. Now he was teaching children to ride, attending community meals, and agreeing to be honored in public ceremony. The transformation should have terrified him, should have triggered every protective instinct that had kept him safe and alone for 20 years. Instead, he felt something closer to peace, a sense that maybe he'd been wrong about what safety really meant. The ceremony was planned for the full moon 3 weeks hence, giving Little Star's community time to prepare properly. Thomas watched the preparations with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, seeing how seriously everyone took the event. It wasn't just about him and Little Star, he realized, but about reaffirming values and traditions that held the community together. In honoring one rescue, they were honoring all the times people had helped each other survive in this harsh land, acknowledging the interdependence that made frontier life possible. Daniel appointed himself Thomas's guide through the process, explaining what would happen with the earnest authority of someone who'd witnessed such ceremonies before. "There'll be food and dancing and storytelling," he said while helping groom Ghost one morning. "And gifts, lots of gifts. Little Star's family has been making things for weeks. Blankets and beadwork and carved items. It's their way of saying thank you when words aren't enough." Thomas listened, trying to prepare himself mentally for being the focus of such attention, reminding himself that this was about cultural necessity rather than personal aggrandizement. Little Star's riding skills continued to improve dramatically, and Thomas suspected she was practicing in secret beyond their regular lessons. She'd moved from simple exercises to more complex maneuvers, learning to guide Ghost through obstacles and respond to subtle changes in his gait and mood. Her connection with the horse had deepened into something extraordinary, a wordless communication that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. Thomas watched them together during lessons and saw what he'd always suspected, that some people were simply meant to work with horses, born with an instinctive understanding that couldn't be taught, but only nurtured. One afternoon, less than a week before the ceremony, Little Star asked if she could try riding Ghost alone, without Thomas leading or Daniel nearby for support. The request represented a significant milestone, the transition from student to independent rider, and Thomas felt an unexpected surge of pride mixed with concern. He helped her mount, adjusted her stirrups, and reminded her of everything they'd practiced. Ghost stood perfectly still through the preparations, understanding in that uncanny way of his that something important was happening. Little Star took a deep breath, gathered the reins with the confident grip Thomas had taught her, and urged Ghost forward with a gentle squeeze of her legs. The horse responded immediately, moving into a smooth walk around the corral while the girl guided him with growing confidence. Thomas watched from the fence, ready to intervene if necessary, but increasingly certain it wouldn't be needed. Little Star and Ghost moved together as if they'd been partners for years rather than months, their communication seamless and intuitive. She progressed from walk to trot, then cautiously into a canter, and Thomas saw her face transform with joy and accomplishment. This was what healing looked like, he thought. Not the absence of scars, but the ability to move forward despite them, to find new strength in places where trauma had tried to create only weakness. Little Star had taken the worst experience of her young life and transformed it into the foundation for something beautiful, a relationship with Ghost that would probably last her lifetime. When she finally brought Ghost to a stop and dismounted, she was breathless with excitement and pride. "Did you see?" she asked unnecessarily, her English improving with each passing week. "Did you see how good Ghost was? How we moved together like one animal?" Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. "You're a real rider now," he said simply. "Ghost trusts you completely, and that's the greatest compliment a horse can give." The night of the ceremony arrived with perfect weather, cool and clear with the full moon rising huge and orange over the desert horizon. Little Star's community had transformed a cleared area near the settlement into a ceremonial space, with fires burning in careful patterns and blankets spread for seating. The entire settlement had been invited, creating a gathering that mixed cultures and traditions in the organic way that characterized frontier life. Thomas arrived with Ghost, both of them brushed and cleaned until they shone, and was immediately welcomed with a warmth that still surprised him despite months of increasing community integration. Blue Dove served as coordinator and translator, moving between groups and ensuring everyone understood what was happening and why. The ceremony began with traditional songs and dances, performances that connected present actions to ancient practices, passed down through generations. Thomas watched with respectful attention, understanding that he was being given a privilege few outsiders received, being allowed to witness and participate in something sacred and deeply meaningful to people who had every reason to distrust white settlers but had chosen to honor one anyway. Little Star appeared dressed in ceremonial clothing her mother had spent weeks creating, beadwork that caught the firelight and made her seem to shimmer as she moved. She stood before the gathered crowd and spoke in her own language, her young voice clear and confident, telling the story of her 3 days in the desert and the moment when Ghost had appeared like a spirit animal to guide her rescuer to her hiding place. Blue Dove translated in segments, ensuring everyone could follow the narrative, and Thomas heard his own role described in terms that made him seem far more heroic than he felt. The gift-giving came next, an elaborate ritual where Little Star's extended family presented Thomas with items that represented different aspects of gratitude and respect. A blanket woven with patterns that told the story of the rescue. A knife with a handle carved to resemble Ghost's flowing mane. Beadwork depicting a white horse under stars. Each gift came with explanation of its significance, its place in their tradition, its meaning as payment for a debt that could never truly be balanced, but must be acknowledged nonetheless. Ghost received his own honors, with Little Star herself placing a beautifully beaded bridle over his head and speaking directly to the horse in her own language. Blue Dove translated her words with obvious emotion. She's telling Ghost that he is her protector and friend, that she will honor him all her life, that when she is old she will tell her grandchildren about the white horse who saved her when the desert tried to take her. The formality and depth of the child's gratitude struck Thomas profoundly, reminding him that what had been one desperate night for him had been a defining moment for Little Star, an experience that would shape the rest of her life. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he felt acutely aware of the inadequacy of words to capture the complexity of emotion and meaning surrounding them. He kept his remarks simple, thanking Little Star's family for their generosity, acknowledging the honor they'd given him and Ghost, expressing his own gratitude that Little Star had survived and thrived. But he also spoke about what the rescue had meant to him personally, how finding one lost child had somehow helped him find parts of himself he'd thought were permanently buried with his brother in Virginia soil. The crowd listened with respectful silence, and when he finished, there was a moment of perfect stillness before applause and affirmation swept through the gathering. Thomas felt hands on his shoulders, heard congratulations and thanks from people he barely knew, experienced the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen and valued by a community he'd joined almost accidentally. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, stripping away the protective isolation he'd maintained for so long, but replacing it with something warmer and more sustaining. The celebration continued long into the night, with food and music and storytelling that wove together different cultural traditions into something new and distinctly frontier. Thomas found himself dancing despite having no skill for it, laughing despite his usual seriousness, talking with people he'd previously kept at arm's length. Daniel stayed close, clearly proud of his role in Thomas's transformation, while Little Star divided her attention between celebrating with her family and checking on Ghost, who stood patiently through the festivities with the calm acceptance of a horse who knew he was loved. As the moon climbed higher and the fires burned lower, Thomas stood at the edge of the gathering, Ghost beside him, and looked out over the assembled people. 6 months ago, he'd been searching desperately for a lost child in the desert night, driven by determination and the ghost of past failure. Tonight he was surrounded by community, honored for an act he still considered simply decent human behavior, watching a child he'd saved dance with joy and freedom under the stars. The transformation seemed impossible, too significant to have happened in such a short time, yet here he was, fundamentally changed by the simple act of refusing to give up when everyone else had accepted defeat. Ghost nudged his shoulder gently, and Thomas turned to meet the horse's wise, dark eyes. "Without you, none of this happens," he said quietly. "Without your instincts and patience and that mysterious ability to find lost things, Little Star dies in those rocks, and I remain the broken man I was before. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever in the war. The belief that I could protect someone, that my presence could make a positive difference instead of just bringing pain. The horse's response was characteristically understated, a soft snort and the gentle pressure of his head against Thomas's chest. But Thomas felt the depth of their bond in that simple contact, the partnership that had made everything else possible. Little Star approached them then, her ceremonial clothing dusty from dancing, but her face radiant with happiness. "Thank you," she said for perhaps the 100th time that evening, but this time she added something new. "Not just for saving me, but for teaching me that scary things can become beautiful things if you're brave enough to keep trying." Thomas felt his eyes sting with unexpected tears, moved by the wisdom in her words and the resilience she embodied. "You taught me the same thing," he replied honestly. "You and Ghost both, showing me that redemption is possible, even when you think it's too late." The months following the ceremony brought a deepening of the patterns established during Little Star's recovery. Thomas's riding lessons expanded to include other children from the settlement, creating a small school of horsemanship that met 3 times weekly. Daniel became his unofficial assistant, helping younger students while continuing to advance his own skills. Little Star progressed beyond basic riding into more advanced techniques, developing abilities that suggested she might someday work with horses professionally, perhaps even breeding and training them herself. Ghost seemed to thrive on the increased activity and attention, his personality expanding to accommodate his new role as teacher to multiple students. The horse, who'd once been content with just Thomas's company, now greeted each day's lessons with obvious enthusiasm, adjusting his behavior to match each rider's skill level with uncanny precision. Thomas watched this transformation with amazement and gratitude, understanding that Ghost had given him not just one gift by finding Little Star, but countless gifts through the opportunities that rescue had opened. Winter came to the desert, with its characteristic harshness, cold nights and occasional snow that transformed the red landscape into something alien and beautiful. The riding lessons continued when weather permitted, with Thomas teaching the children how to care for horses in difficult conditions, how to read signs of distress or illness, how to prepare for emergencies that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. These were lessons born from his own hard experience, knowledge purchased through years of frontier living, and he found deep satisfaction in passing them on to the next generation. On a particularly cold evening, Thomas sat in his cabin with the gifts from the ceremony displayed on his shelves, each one a reminder of connection and purpose. The carved white horse sat in the place of honor, catching lamplight and seeming to glow with inner life. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, isolated and convinced his purpose had died with his brother on a Virginia battlefield. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. Dr. Patterson stopped by one evening with news that would cement Thomas's place in the settlement's future. The territorial government had authorized funding for a proper school, and they wanted someone to teach practical frontier skills alongside traditional academic subjects. "Would you consider it?" the doctor asked. "Teaching riding and horse care and desert survival to students who need those skills as much as they need reading and arithmetic." The formal recognition of his value struck Thomas deeply, representing acceptance and respect he'd never sought, but found himself grateful to receive. He accepted the position, understanding it would mean even deeper integration into community life, less time for solitude, more responsibility for shaping young lives. But he also recognized it as the natural progression of changes begun the night he'd refused to stop searching for a lost child. His life was no longer his own in the selfish sense he'd once demanded, but belonged instead to something larger, a web of relationships and obligations that gave meaning beyond mere survival. Little Star's mother approached him one spring morning with a request that surprised him with its significance. She wanted to gift him a horse, a young mare from her family's small herd, so that Ghost might have a companion and potentially sire foals that would carry his exceptional bloodline forward. The offer represented trust and respect beyond anything Thomas had imagined, acknowledging not just his skill with horses, but his worthiness to be part of their community's future in tangible, lasting ways. Thomas accepted with gratitude, understanding the honor being offered. The mare was beautiful, golden brown with intelligent eyes and gentle temperament, and Ghost took to her immediately. Watching the two horses together in the expanded corral Thomas built, he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness and belonging he'd thought was forever lost to him. This was home now, not just a place he'd ended up, but somewhere he'd chosen, and been chosen by in return. Daniel and Little Star continued their lessons through spring and into summer, both progressing to the point where Thomas could honestly say they were accomplished riders. Little Star in particular had developed skills that drew attention from beyond the settlement, and Thomas fielded inquiries from ranchers interested in hiring her once she was old enough. He protected her from pressure to decide her future too quickly, understanding that childhood should be allowed to run its course despite the harsh realities of frontier life. One evening, riding out alone with Ghost to check on the mare grazing in a distant pasture, Thomas found himself at the rock formation where he'd discovered Little Star nearly a year earlier. The place looked different in evening light, less menacing, just another feature of the desert landscape. He dismounted and walked to the crevice where the child had been wedged, remembering that moment of discovery and the desperate hope that had driven his careful extraction. Standing there now, Thomas understood that this place marked more than just Little Star's rescue. It marked his own rescue from a life half-lived, from the prison of guilt and isolation he'd built around himself. Ghost had led him here, yes, but the horse had also led him out, back toward light and connection and the possibility of peace. The desert had tried to take a child's life but had instead given Thomas back his own, transforming tragedy into triumph through the simple act of refusing to surrender to despair. He returned to Ghost and mounted, ready to ride home to the settlement where people waited, where students would arrive tomorrow morning eager for lessons, where Little Star would greet him with her brilliant smile, and Daniel would ask his endless, thoughtful questions. Home, where a community had claimed him despite his resistance, where a white horse had proven that sometimes the lost could be found and the broken could be made whole. The desert stretched endless in all directions, beautiful and terrible, and full of possibilities. Thomas Whitfield rode across it with confidence born from experience and purpose, born from connection, no longer a solitary man fleeing from pain, but a teacher, friend, and protector moving toward a future bright with promise. Ghost's white coat gleamed in the setting sun, and together they headed home.